So if you're a dad out there today and you had a kid up here or one of these three, this is what Dad's Day is about. Being able to come into the house of the Lord and watch our kids be an example. I got to be that example at first service because my dad was here. And he's back at the house now and probably going to buy my lunch after. And then I'll tell him Happy Father's Day. But, if you look at the front of your bulletin today, you'll see a very handsome-looking family. When Sheila was asking what picture I wanted on the front, and I decided that 4 generations of Hallams would be a kind of a cool thing to have on there for this sermon that I'm giving today. And I'm going to tell you ahead of time, I have to warn you, I'm going to tell the story of my dad and myself, and it gets emotional. Now, I don't ever get emotional, but just in case there's emotion on some of your faces, be prepared. My dad was sobbing at the end of the sermon today. I think he's got a cold coming on or something. But I just want you to be aware, I was in a class, and we had to give sermons, and it's all pastor wannabes that are in there. And we're given sermons, and when I got done with a sermon similar to this one, I had nobody criticizing me at all. It was all positive, and one guy finally had to say, well, you could have warned us that you were going to get personal with us because I felt like you were in my face about, and I'm thinking he had an issue that I was preaching about that he needed to deal with, and so he got upset about it. But everybody else liked it. I'm going to talk about my dad and I, and it's not easy to talk about it, especially when he's sitting here, but it has a good ending, so just be prepared. If people need to get Kleenex, now's the time to get up and do it. Someone wrote these humorous words entitled, "The World According to Dad." These are words that most dads have said at some time or another to their children. This is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. Don't forget to check the oil. I don't even know if we do that anymore because my car tells me when it's ready. I don't know. Bring back all the change. How should I know? Ask your mother. I'm not made out of money. When I was your age, I walked 5 miles to and from school each day, and it was uphill both ways. And if you lived up north, you did so in the snow and barefoot. You're going, and you will have fun. Who's paying the bills around here anyway? If you break your leg, don't come running to me. Sometimes takes a little bit for that one. Don't come running and see if legs broke. Anyway. About 3 seconds later, Earl got it in first service. So, don't put your feet on the furniture. Your mother will kill you. Quit playing with your food. Be quiet. Can't you see I'm trying to think? My stepdad backed into a pole and said almost the same thing. Will you guys shut up? I can't see what I'm doing. Okay. I don't know what it had to do with his seeing, but as he backed into the pole, we had to be the ones to get blamed. So it's okay. Why? Because I said so. You better get that junk picked up before your mother comes in here. Just wait till you have kids of your own. I was not asleep. I was just resting my eyes. Someone said parents spend the first part of a child's life urging him to talk and walk, and the rest of his childhood telling him to sit down and keep quiet. One that I will always remember is, don't make me pull this car over. Being the oldest of 6 in a station wagon, 3 of us facing out the back window, it only happened once that I remember being threatened, but I kind of think I was in the threesome that got pulled out that day. I can't remember. It's unimportant. As I share today a couple of stories of dads and sons, I will begin by reading our scripture this morning, and it comes from Genesis 22, 1 through 14. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told them about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do nothing to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from him your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." It's quite an unusual story of a dad and his son. Let's think about it for a minute. Abraham had struggled to have a son for many years. At age 100, God blessed him with his son Isaac. As a newborn, Isaac had no way of knowing that his century-old dad was older than most men who had just had their first child. He was soon to learn one thing about his dad. His dad loved God. In verse 2, God tells Abraham, "Take your one and only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Abraham asked Isaac to come with him. He brought with him 2 servants, and they headed to the mountains. Abraham asked the servants to wait while he and Isaac climbed the mountain. Isaac loved his father and allowed him to load him with firewood as his father carried the fire and the knife to be used in the sacrifice. I had always imagined that Isaac was a young boy, but according to the NIV Study Bible and notes from my Bible, he could have been a teenager or a young adult. In the second part of verse 7, Isaac said to his father, "The fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Isaac allowed his father to bind him and place him on the altar. They had worked together to build. Nowhere could I find where Isaac had argued with his dad about being used as a sacrifice or being bound. It is this pastor's opinion that their relationship was very strong and their obedience to the Father even stronger. My study Bible states that Isaac could have been used as a prefiguration of Christ, and prefiguration means to picture or imagine beforehand, to foresee. While Abraham obeyed God, he was rewarded by not having to sacrifice his son. The relationship between God and Abraham, I'm sure, was strengthened after Abraham was instructed to let Isaac go. I would guess that Isaac now saw his father's love for God as he showed his obedience. I'm going to ask Holly to stand up if she would for a second, and she's going to sign you what Abraham looks like in sign language. And as he's ready to kill his son, God sends an angel to speak, and it saves him. And it shows as the angel would pull back his arm and keep him from doing so. And when you see it in a song, it's really pretty emotional to watch and to see his name in sign language. If you obeyed God's word to love and forgive, will there be someone in your life that you could mend a relationship with? Is there someone you could strengthen a relationship with? The ladies that just got up here and told a little bit about hearing a story that was useful to them or that they could relate to, I hope you get something out of today's message from here on. Because it's going to be the story of my dad and I. Our son Josh was 10 when he accepted my invitation to go to his first Promise Keeper event. We headed up to Soldier Field in Chicago from Fort Wayne, Indiana. From a dad's point of view, I was very excited. We left the church with 4 other men in our van, and we're traveling with another van load of men from our church. Josh and I were together for what would be a great Promise Keeper event. If you don't know what Promise Keepers is, it's just a few years back, Coach McCarthy, who coached the Colorado football team, wanted something more out of life, and he started an event that started bringing men to stadiums and talking to them about relationships with their spouses, their families, with themselves, with God. And they filled stadium after stadium. I've been to 10 of these events in my lifetime, and probably 4 or 5 of them were in settings of about 50,000 men. And Soldier Field, where the Bears play football, was no exception. We had about 50,000 men there. And the theme that year dealt with 7 promises of a promise keeper from the standpoint of family. At one point, Ken Davis had each father and son stand and hold hands and look each other in the eyes. So we stood, and he got fathers that were maybe out at the concession stand, and he said, "Find your sons right now. I'm going to give you time." And if they had more than one son, they got in a semicircle or a circle and held hands so the dad and the sons could look at each other eye to eye. At no time were we to look at him on the stage. We were just to listen to what he said and stare at our dads and our sons. We were then told to tell our son or sons that what we needed to do to be a better dad. And each son was told, "You tell your dad what you could do to be a better son." And then we were to tell each other that we loved each other. And for Josh and I, this was simple. While we were doing the exercise, I was wondering if I could do the same thing if my dad were there. You see, I was 38 years old, but I couldn't remember my dad ever telling me he loved me. And I couldn't remember if I had told him. I left the weekend having had a great experience with my son and knowing I had to make changes in my attitude and my relationship with my dad. I want to take you back a little bit into history now. And in 1962, when my brothers and I were 5, 3, and 1, my parents decided to divorce. We saw my dad off and on for the next couple of years, but then for various reasons, I didn't see him from the age of 7 until I was 21. Those very crucial years when a boy needs his dad, I grew up with a stepdad. When Holly and I got married in 1978, my Hallam grandparents were invited to the wedding. When they arrived, they had a present and 2 cards. One of the cards had some cash in it and a note saying, "I know this isn't much after all this time, but we want to wish you luck in your wedding and your married life." It was my first contact with my dad in 14 years. Needless to say, I went through a gamut of emotions. After we had sent all our thank yous, we received a note from my dad and stepmom saying that they would like to get together. In October of that year, we went to visit and then began seeing them about twice a year. It was important for me that our children knew their grandparents, and I'll explain. I was going to bring this morning, I didn't. At home in my little safe, I have a cartoon caricature of me sitting in a chair, and it's from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in their Ripley's Believe It or Not column. And it says, "Little Gary Ray Hallam was born with 13 living parents, or grandparents, great-grandparents, or great-great-grandparents." So I had 13 grandparents when I was born. I remember most of my great-great-grandparents. There's one set that I don't, but the other ones I did. Now, you think back to when people that were farmers, they would get married early. Some of them would quit school to keep the farm going. Well, my grandparents were probably right around 18, I think, when they had my mom, and then my mom was 18 when she had me. So my grandparents were 36 years old. I mean, that's pretty young. I've heard of it younger, but that's pretty young. So following that Promise Keeper weekend, the meeting that Josh and I attended, I knew that I had to change my feelings towards my dad and my visits there. I wanted those visits not to just be about my kids, but I wanted it to be about me too. On Thursday of that, well, I have to say that on God's calendar, He had this plotted out way ahead of time. I was headed to my dad's the following weekend after the Promise Keeper meeting. I never would have planned that. I would have wanted time to think about and plan out what I was going to say to my dad. It wasn't the case. We were going to head to their house in Kankakee, Illinois the next weekend. On Thursday, I met with my accountability group. There were 7 of us, and we met every Thursday night. And I told them to pray for me as we were going to my dad's house the next night. I really felt that God was telling me that I needed to talk to my dad, but I had no idea what I was going to say or how I was going to say it. One thing was for sure, I knew I needed to talk to him. We were packing to leave on Friday evening when the phone rang. Holly answered it. She came upstairs to tell me that our next door neighbor, my accountability brother, and my good friend Lee Slofer had called to tell me he was praying for me, and she asked what it was about, and I said, "I think I'm supposed to talk to my dad this weekend." I knew in my head that of the other guys sitting in that meeting last night, Lee was the only one that remembered my request. Because that's how we were. We would get up and say we would pray, and I'm sure we went home and forgot about it. But Lee was too good of a friend, and he knew this was too important of a meeting for him not to pray. It was a sign that I had to go through with my plan. We arrived on Friday evening, just in time to say hi and basically head to bed. The next day, my dad and Daisy were out on the deck watching the river and having coffee. After talking a few minutes, Daisy announced that she was going to get breakfast started. I knew this was the only window I would have that weekend to talk to my dad, and I just prayed a quick prayer and asked God for the right words to say. I told my dad some stories that reminded me of Grandpa Hallam the week before at Promise Keepers, and he shared a story about my grandpa that he wanted me to hear too. And then I told him that whatever happened between he and my mom was in the past. I wanted him to know that I had forgiven him. I told him that I wanted to come to his house as much for me as for my kids. He then shared with me some of the reasons he had not seen me during the 14 years I was growing up. I now know that there are two sides to every story, and I always had assumed that, but I never heard his side. I told him that whatever happened was in the past, and then thought back to the previous weekend, and I told him I loved him. He told me he loved me too. For the first time in many years, we had talked through some things that had been unsaid. With God's help, we worked through some concerns and questions that needed to be addressed. I left that weekend and felt a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. As we drove back to Indiana, Josh from the back seat said, "You talked to Grandpa this weekend, didn't you?" I said, "Well, I talked to Grandpa a lot this weekend." And he goes, "No, you really talked to him, didn't you? There was something different about you and him the rest of the weekend." How a 10-year-old knew we had talked is beyond me, but he had seen a difference. Abraham and Isaac had a relationship that was built on faith in God and love for each other. I feel that my relationship with Josh is the same way. I had always struggled with the commandment, love thy father and mother. I always felt that I was only fulfilling half of the commandment. Friends would tell me I had to obey the whole commandment, and I said, "You don't understand." The Promise Keeper weekend allowed me to finally hear God telling me to talk to my dad. Because I was obedient, that relationship has blossomed. My dad only lives 1.5 hours away from me now. It isn't unusual to look up on a Sunday morning and see him. At Grace, I would look up and there would be he and Daisy. They would be in the sanctuary before I was some Sundays. And I'm like, "What are you guys doing here?" He wouldn't have to call me. He could just show up and everything would be fine now. But my question to you this morning is there a relationship that you need to take a good look at? Maybe it's a parent. Maybe it's a sibling. Maybe it's the person you sit next to at work. And if so, I'm going to beg you this morning to reach out to that person, to at least try. If you do your part, God's going to be happy. If you don't, I don't know what He's going to be. I know that it took 38 years for me to be able to do it, so maybe it's not going to be that easy to just go out and do today. Not only my dad, but I remember Nicole's graduation party, and my dad and my mom were in the same room for the first time. And it was a room no bigger than this room. And for 4 hours, my dad sat at a table talking to my brother, and I had 200 people in our church praying that there wouldn't be a World War III start during that day. My dad and stepmom got up and left. My mom never knew he was in the room. I guarantee you those prayers helped. Because my mom saw my brother talking to someone and she never looked to see who it was, because my brother sat there basically protecting her from him the whole time. It was hard. I then got accused by my mom of being a chicken because I didn't tell her. And I have to admit, I was a coward. And I wrote her a letter explaining and apologizing for that. But it took a year to compose that letter and to make her realize that at some point in time, she needed to talk to my dad or work it out with God about my dad. And so The letters went back and forth a couple of times, but she agreed, I will forgive, I won't forget, and that's okay. I'm fine with that, Mom. I'm glad you had to. But I'm sure that some of you may be in that same situation, and I'm asking this morning, this pastor, my office will always be available if you need to come talk about it. Come talk about it, because I can share with you my story. 7 to 21. Those are the years when I'm playing baseball and football, basketball, doing everything at school, because we had a school of 130 kids. If you weren't involved, then you got kicked out of school. So you were doing something all the time. I didn't tell all this part about my mom at first service, just so you know. So don't tell my dad if you see him this afternoon. But the point is that both of them had to have a talk, and I needed a talk from God at that weekend in Chicago, or I still might not be talking to my dad. But because of that, things were freed up, and I can talk to him now. I'm asking you today to think about those relationships, and if there's one out there that you know you really need to mend, then I'm just asking that you start praying about it, if nothing else. Let's pray. Father God, we come, and it's not always easy to get up and just share about hurt and what it's like to not even know your own dad for 14 years. And some people in here can beat that, I'm sure. And I pray for you, and I feel bad for you that you don't have that opportunity. Some of us may not have even ever known our dads. So this morning, I pray that God will be your Father, no matter what. And when we come to Him, and when we know that there's someone we need to make amends with, that He's going to back us up. He'll give us the words. He'll help us, as He did to me that weekend many years ago. Father, we love you, and we are just so glad that we have you as our Father, because we know that you will never fail us. And I pray now that as we prepare to leave, that we will take you with us. And if we can talk to no other dad but you today, that I pray that it happens, that we have the opportunity to say thanks for being our dad. In Jesus' holy name, amen.